Hello, Bernard Ollis.
Hello, Richard Morecroft. Lovely to be here.
It's a delight to have you there as well. And your exhibition is The Artist's Garden, Part 1, at Harvey Galleries in Sydney. And we'll talk about the exhibition in just a moment, of course, but as usual, let me try and remind the viewer that the way to get the best value out of this discussion is to go to the gallery website to actually find the exhibition catalogue or the images, have a look at those images, have that website open at the same time as listening to our discussion. And so we will talk about particular works and then the viewer will be able to see them. So look, welcome Bernard, and the Artist's Garden, and not just any old artist's garden, but who are some of the artists that you're peering into their foliage?
Well, apart from my own garden and the garden I share with Wendy Sharp, my partner, who's also, as you probably know, an artist, I also have done the Whiteley Gardens in this Part 1 exhibition. That's Wendy Whiteley doing, homage, if you like, to Brett Whiteley. And it also travels overseas. It goes from Monet at Giverny to Cézanne at Aix-en-Provence to Renoir on the Côte d'Azur, the south of France. It covers a lot of artists.
Well, an extraordinary range, and of course, a little bit of a focus there in France. So you take us very much to some French gardens. What was the genesis of this idea of painting artists' gardens?
Okay, it's like a lot of things, they happen almost by default. It started that I had a knee problem. I couldn't bend my legs, and I was starting to struggle more and more going on my walk, which I normally do from Erskineville to St. Peter's, which is where this wonderful studio is, and I was getting worse and worse. Anyway, to cut it short, I had a meniscus root repair, which meant I had 6 weeks on crutches, 6 weeks at home.
Oh dear.
6 weeks going around and thinking, I'm feeling sorry for myself, I'm a very bad patient, and thinking, what can I do with this time productively? So I would say to Wendy, please set up in the garden, get me all my oil pastels and get me all my paint and a few other things and buckets and things and rags, and get me all the paper, etc. And I'll put it all down here, and then I'll limp my way across to that and sit down and start drawing the garden. And therefore, the garden, that's our garden, was the starting point, the catalyst for other things. And I did this whole series of gardens, of our garden, and we've done. We're artists, so it's got lots of statues in it and different things. So it's an interesting space anyway. But I literally used it as a source material, and then I thought to myself, I've been to so many artist gardens, and you mentioned the French. Well, it's true with France that France reveres its artists and its artist studios and often their gardens. And I started to think about artists' gardens that I'd visited, but particularly not so much that an artist has a garden, but more importantly, has the garden played a role in their art? Has it been an inspiration, or they've used floral design or whatever else? Have they in some ways been influenced by it? So if you look at Monet at Giverny, and if you look at Matisse in the south of France, in Vence, yes, they have. The cutout shapes of Matisse are about his garden. So I'd been and visited those gardens and had lots and done drawings while I was there, and walked into their studios, because they're often, being French, they're often set up as a pilgrimage or a homage to the artist, and had gone and visited lots of those places. So I had all the raw material and source there to go ahead, and I threw myself into it. And like 18 months later, this is part 1 of part 2 of lots of gardens and studios where artists have been intimate with their spaces and found exciting stimuli from that natural thing that appears.
Well, clearly you found those gardens very exciting stimuli, and you did throw yourself in with gusto. I'd like to go to some of the specific works now, and let's start with, you mentioned Matisse. Let's start with the work Villa La Rêve, Matisses Studio and Garden. We actually get to see not only elements of the garden there, but we also see a quite grand building. Tell us about that work.
Well, it was Matisse's studio in the latter part of his life. He died in the early 1950s, and so he was there during the war period, Second World War, and through at the end. So that's interesting in itself. So at the time that his daughter, wife was involved in the resistance in Paris and all that, Matisse is painting away in this studio, and he had rheumatism, and so he's doing cutout shapes, those famous last works of Matisse, which are cutout gouache or large jazz series works, etc. And he also painted he also did the chapel in Vence as well at that time. So there's a whole history of it. It happened that it is now a workshop art centre, and you can go in there and you can rent it for a period of time. And I was fortunate enough, again with Wendy, to go there and to walk through the garden and to walk through the spaces. And I always feel incredibly moved when I walk through a space that I know an artist of that caliber has walked through before. I'm climbing the same staircase, I'm walking out on the same veranda, I'm opening the same shutters, and I'm looking out at something which is not too dissimilar to his exact view 50 years or 70 years ago. So that's interesting in itself.
You are quite literally putting yourself there in Matisse's footsteps. And I guess
absolutely.
for the viewer of these works, that's what they're being invited to experience as well.
And exactly. And what happens as you sit there and you start drawing what's around you, you think in the back of your mind, I wonder how Matisse would have dealt with that. He would have simplified that shape. I wonder. And so you actually become a little, I mean, they're still Bernard Ollis works, but they've got a bit of the spirit of the reflections in the window or the colors or the simplicity of his organic shapes. Some of those are coming through in the works as well. So it's got that double thing of looking at an artist as an inspirational person and trying to, put in my own positive views and celebratory views on being in such a wonderful place.
And in a way also, from how you describe it, bringing in a little of your own experience physically of being there and absorbing, if you like, a little of the ghost of Matisse, a little of that essence that is still there, and the other artists that we're going to talk about shortly. One of the things that is very striking about this exhibition is that some of the works, and the one we just mentioned there, the Villa La Rêve work, and several others, are very large, much larger than perhaps usually you present for exhibitions. What gave you that real boost into size, and how did you find that?
Well, it's actually, I'm talking to the gallery as well, and I'm saying to Trevor Harvey in the Mossman Gallery, I feel like I want to do these on quite a large scale. And being practical as an artist, you always are a little concerned if you go large because you limit your audience. It's as simple as that. But I felt that I wanted to explore my way through, and I sensed if I did them on a larger scale, they might have a different resonance, if you like. And so that's exactly what I did. And as soon as I started working large, I ordered 8 other large canvases, and I just thought, to hell with it. I'm going to go with this, go with the flow. This is creatively what I feel like doing at the moment. And so damn the consequences. I'm just going to work on this scale and throw my stuff into these larger works, which I used to do in the past, but more recently have perhaps adapted to a more manageable scale. These shouted out at me, they're big paintings, Bernard, do them big.
And just for the viewer, having a look at the images on the website, these large works are approximately what sort of size?
Well, they're approximately sort of 7 foot by 5 foot in old measurements. So they're, 190 centimeters by 170 centimeters, that kind of scale. So they're big and they take up a wall, but they hopefully really enliven that wall. So I felt good about working on that scale. I'm also should add that I have the luxury, which you can't see from here, of having a large warehouse studio, so I can put them all up around me and look at them, walk the wall as I'm going with them. So I just threw myself in the deep end with them and enjoyed working on that scale, irrespective of what happens from there.
And going to the other end of the scale, and going back to the beginning of the story when you were talking about making works in your own garden, one of the ones that I'd like to take you back to, one of the smaller works in the exhibition, is the Ollis Sharp Garden Erskineville 2. Lovely rich patterning, but there is in the background, I think, if I'm correct, a little homage to Matisse.
Well, and it's actually there in the garden for real. There was a big white wall which was crying out for either Wendy and I to paint on or do something with, because we didn't just want the white wall, which I think actually is a foil for the washing machine and other things that are hidden behind it. So we wanted to do something about that. And the story is, we tossed a coin literally, and Wendy won and said, "Oh, I'm going to do a big Matisse there." So she ended up doing the dance painting, circling around, and put it on the wall. It looks fantastic. So I just added that to the work and put that into the garden because it's part of the same spirit. So that's how it happened. Yeah.
And one of the things in this work where we go into your garden is that it also, as so many of the works in the exhibition have, but it's a great example of the richness and diversity of pattern observation that you bring to so many of your works. And clearly there seems to be a fascination for you with pattern. Tell us about what you look for and what you find when pattern is something that you discover in a play.
That is true. And I think that, I like working with pattern, and I suppose in essence all paintings are abstract and they're all about pattern. So I like the rhythms and movements. I like also to do things which are beyond the peripheral vision that we have. In other words, something behind me or something above me or something below me, if I can bring that into the work, even though my eye can't actually see it, but I can bring that in. I like the idea of distorting space and moving through passages of time and space, and also bringing in that pattern where I need to. And the other thing, of course, you've got to do is be selective. You can't throw it all in. If you bring things in from the outside or from beyond 180 degrees, what you have to do is omit something that's stuck in front of you, which might be far more mundane. So I'm always looking at ways that we can move through and into space and create pattern and create focus and give you a kind of intensity. It's a sort of bird's eye view. It's a sort of hovering drone view of going through the garden, and it's looking at a lot of things at the same time. But I enjoy that journey to go on myself because it's exciting, and hopefully the end result is also exciting for the viewer.
And so in a way, the work that results is like an agglomeration of experience. There are a whole lot of things that maybe, as you say, you couldn't see if you were just standing in the one spot. But if you walked around, you would have all of those experiences, and then your work actually brings all those experiences together in the one visual source.
That's the attempt to do that, and it's something that I've always enjoyed. So when we were talking before about somebody like Cézanne, who they talk about as the father of modern art, because he was looking at a number of different viewpoints of the mountain at the same time, I rather like that idea. So I'm actually thinking, what a great bit of thought. It's not a photographic, pictorial one viewpoint. It's taking in a number of different experiences. It's taking in time, the time to move around and through into other spaces and bring other things in that will add and enrich the experience that you're actually looking at. That's something that I think from very early days I've been interested in, and I'm trying to, you know, hone in on it and get it to work more, you know, as well as I possibly can.
You mentioned Cézanne just a moment ago, and I'd actually now like to go to what I think is probably my favourite work in the exhibition, and that's Cézannes Studio. And it has got a lovely connection with garden or outside world through the windows, but it also has wonderful use of colour. There are these fabulous green shadows that you've chosen to put in and incorporate. Give us a little bit of a sense about what it was like to be in Cézannes Studio.
Well, I've been there several times, and the first time I went was actually probably the most memorable, in that it was, I think it was a Tuesday morning, and it was cold and wet, and I arrived before any other coach parties or anybody else at all. And so I went there and sat in his studio, as all artists would love to do, and thought, this is the great Cézanne Studio, and this is where he lived in the latter part of his life. This is where he produced some of his most famous paintings of Mont Saint-Victoire and some of the and fruit bowls, etc. Okay, so I'm sat in there thinking, wow, this is incredible. And what's interesting, and this is an advert for it, if you like, if you ever go to Aix-en-Provence, which is where it is on the hill, when you go inside there, they put his fruit bowls up, and they put bits and pieces of things around. You can see where his coat is hung on the hook. You can see where he has been. You can see his palette, and it looks like he's just popped out for 10 minutes. It's a wonderful feeling of being very, very close to him. It's a bit like if you hear the door go, you think, oh, he's just come back in again. You actually feel you're there, and that's a very intimate, beautiful feeling. I exaggerated the Mont Saint-Victoire. From his window, there's a brick wall nowadays, and you can't see it, but it's just around the corner. And that's where he used to go for a walk and then go and look at those mountains. And there's all plaques everywhere of where he painted this view of it, where he painted that view, where he painted it at 6 a.m., where he painted it at 6 p.m., etc., etc. So you get a real sense of being in his studio space and looking at the thing that kept him going for the last decade of his life, trying to solve the problem of getting Mont Saint-Victoire look like a real mountain and make it work in his own particular manner.
Well, in your own particular manner, as I mentioned, this work is a lovely example of where you have chosen to employ fascinating and slightly unconventional colours. I mentioned the green shadows. Tell us about your approach to colour, because it's certainly strong and vibrant, but what is actually the principle behind your approach?
I think if someone said, what kind of artist are you, or what's your style, sometimes people say, I don't really think I've got a style as such, but I do talk about being or admiring expressionism. And expressionism, of course, is the intensification of heightening colour in order to add to the drama, in order to add to the theatre. You can't just throw it all in, kitchen sink and all, because otherwise it just, you know, falls around all over the place. But I am conscious, therefore, of intensifying and therefore some of those green shadows are my way of looking at. I mean, they're probably more brown, but they've got a bit of green in them from reflected light, and so I move it that way. So often what is hinted at, I explore and push a little bit further. Now, sometimes when you do that, of course, it doesn't work. It's the old story. It's trial and error. But I like the idea of therefore coming up with something which you describe as a little unusual or unique or whatever, trying to push things in a way that they wouldn't, you know, that in reality they are not. Somebody once said to me, why don't you try to paint the grass, but don't use green? And I thought at first, what a ridiculous thing to say. And then I thought about it and I thought, no, he's absolutely right. There's all sorts of other complementary colors working inside the grass, in the stalks. There's, you know, there's intense black, there's purple, there's blue, there's all sorts of grays, there's all sorts of other things happening through that space. There's reflected light, refracted light, there's everything else. And that's a good way of thinking about it rather than do it in the obvious manner.
Let's take a little bit of a quick trip, because our time is moving on, and I want to go to one or two other of the artists' gardens, and if you could maybe give us a quick journey to them. As I mentioned them, Monets Studio and Garden. It's such a well-known, iconic spot, but what have you found there?
Well, I've been there again a couple of times, and on one occasion there was very few people there because it was a bit cold that day and rainy. And of course, if it's a sunny day, you almost forget it because you're just crowded out. You're trying to cross the Japanese bridge along with more tourists, and then you can poke a stick at. So it's an interesting experience to go through. But I think that, I mean, if we think about artist gardens, it's almost a cliche. We think of those wonderful, huge Monet water lilies. He planted his own garden. He set it up so he could experiment and sit there all day long, look at it from different angles, and come up with incredibly abstracted, beautiful reflections and sources of different color and you know, reflections from the sky, from the trees, etc., etc. And I always find the way he's pushed abstraction a very exciting thing. So I sat there and I did some drawings. I took loads of photographs, and so it was quite an easy painting for me to do, to sit there and think, I want to do a Bernard Ollis version of this. I don't want to pretend I'm Monet because I'm not, but I am going to try to deal with some sources of the master and try to show some of those things that have made it work. And again, I played around with it. I made some big mistakes on it and I scratched them out. I tried to work rapidly because Monet is about rapid motion and fluidity rather than stilted, you know. As soon as you get tight, it's destroyed. Monet is about keeping things flowing and moving, and I really enjoyed the experience of going through and painting the picture. Yeah,
a very different feel of garden, and you've captured this. And if you could describe your work here, Renoir's Garden. What are the characteristics that you've captured there?
When you go to Renoir's Garden at Caen-sur-Mer in the south of France, there's little plaques that all the way along of the paintings that he did when he's in his wheelchair, and he got everybody to stop for him, and then he did these paintings. And so you go along. So it's a really interesting, exciting thing to do, to walk through his particular, you know, over the cobblestones in this rickety old, you know, chair that he's in, and just see what he did. So I'm looking at that. I'm looking at the views. I'm looking at some of his sculpture and some of his works around. So the whole physical thing of being in that garden and the olive trees and the plants and what's happening. Again, I walked up and down, I drew, I made little notes. I often do that. I do little line drawings, and then I put like shopping list on it saying, this is more purple, this should be this. And then I took photographs, and then I came back, and then from memory, I started to work on that. And that's how it develops. It's going up Renoir's pathway, and there were lots of little broken corrugated or broken pebble stones, really, like crazy paving, if you like. And that gave it a particular kind of, that was my main source, walking up the garden path and putting his studio in at the end. What I'm also doing is I'm moving things around. You can't quite see the studio from where I was, but as I told you before, I bring things in. So in some ways to encapsulate the whole sense, the whole feeling of it, so that you're actually there and experiencing those things, and you're hovering your way through. And around the corner, you're going to see another painting, and around the other corner, you're going to, you know, step inside the studio itself.
They are such richly experiential works, and it's been great to hear about them. I did note that the exhibition title was The Artist's Garden Part 1, so there is a Part 2.
There's a part two, and originally it was designed to be a large-scale exhibition, and we've sort of pared it down a bit. And part two is taking place, and we both kind of done a handshake on when the situation, this world situation, pandemic situation, goes back to normal, and we don't know when that will be. But then part two will take place, and that includes artist gardens like Elizabeth Cummings, Guy Warren, you know, a whole load of different people, Ken Doan's garden in Mossman, lots of different gardens that I visited and wandered through and looked at their spaces, because I wanted to bring in a, you know, a big Australian aspect of it as well, and not just about exotic gardens overseas, but to bring, you know, I live here most of the time, and I wanted to take on those challenges as well. So all that's intriguing, but that you will see, and they're all finished and ready to go, but we're waiting for the right time to be able to do it.
Well, we look forward to part two, but for now, Bernard Ollis, thank you for sharing part one with us.
Thank you, Richard, very much for the questions.